best-selling author and founder of the Mindset Institute, Dr. Daniel Siegel. Dr. Siegel is a clinical professor of psychiatry at the UCLA School of Medicine and the founding co-director of the Mindful Awareness Research Center at UCLA. He is also the executive director of the Mindset Institute, which focuses on the development of mindsight, which teaches insight, empathy, and integration in individuals, families, and communities. Dr. Siegel has published extensively for both professional and lay audiences and has 5 New York Times bestsellers and many additional books. Dr. Siegel also serves as the founding editor for the Norton Professional series of Interpersonal Neurobiology, which contains over 70 textbooks.
So a very warm welcome, Dan. I'm so happy you're here with us today.
Thank you, Thomas. A pleasure to be here with you.
So I remember our former conversations as deeply inspiring, and I'm so happy that you join our summit here today. I have lots of questions for you, since you are one of the experts on trauma and health, also mindfulness and trauma. So I would maybe jump in right away. And so my first question, just to give our listeners also a bit of an overview. So why do you think it's important nowadays to be trauma informed? So what's the importance of trauma in the understanding of our health, of our life together, of human relationships? And maybe we start here and then we can zoom in a bit more specifically.
Well, thank you. And you and I have had this conversation about what understanding trauma can do for how individual lives can be lived with more freedom, how, relational lives in one-on-one relationships or in families can be really supported by understanding trauma. And then on a larger level, whether it's looking at a classroom and a school, understanding trauma-informed education, or the way we function as a community and the larger culture in which we live, societies that understand the impact of trauma on the members of the society, can actually make choices that are health promoting rather than reinforcing some of the sad ways that trauma can really negatively impact our individual and collective lives. So the first general thing to just say is that, to be informed about trauma is to give yourself the opportunity to be freed from the way we adapt to traumatic experience. So, I can talk for an hour on just that one question, but I'm going to keep my responses very brief so it can be more interactive unless you want me to go on further. You just tell me.
That's fantastic. So let's start with a human relationship and like how trauma is being created often through, maybe let's say call it inappropriate relationships, and how the healing of trauma is connected to functional or appropriate relationships. Let's talk a little bit about the relation and trauma. And
the journey for myself to understand that question, I think began by understanding where the field of mental health was in terms of those two words. What is the mental, what is the mind, and what is the health? And trauma is just one example where I think broadly the field of mental health, by actually not defining what the mental is, what the mind is, and not defining what the health is, has kind of been grasping at looking at things through a negative lens, like disorder, and post-traumatic stress disorder just being one, where, we can label all the symptoms and talk about it as a syndrome, and have a way of describing it. But for me, both as a clinician And as a scientist studying, parent-child relationships and looking at something called developmental trauma, where you see the study of trauma, of abuse and neglect woven from the fabric of the relationships within a family, it was very natural to, ask, how is the mind both within the relational field of the family, and how is the mind also inside the individual? In this case, let's say we'll talk about the child, or you could talk about the parent, because one of the biggest predictors of the most challenging attachment pattern, called disorganized attachment, it's about 5 to 15% of the general population, is from unresolved trauma in the parent. And so what that research demonstrated was that when the parent has lack of resolution of trauma or loss, there's an extremely high likelihood that the most difficult attachment pattern, called disorganized attachment, emerges in that child's relationship to that parent. And then what is absolutely amazing is we've shown in the field of attachment research that if a parent has resolved the trauma, resolved the loss, they will not have this increased likelihood of their child having a disorganized attachment to them. So this is back in the mid-'80s, and it really struck me as a student of child and adolescent psychiatry that here was an example of relational trauma that could empirically be demonstrated to be related to unresolved trauma in the parent, and the resolution of the trauma could make it so you didn't develop this really painful form of attachment. So that was where you just began, this is a long time ago now, to see relationality as the source of trauma, and also relationality shaped by unresolved states. So back then it was like, okay, well, what is the mind of the child and what's the mind of the parent? What is that actually? What is a healthy mind that's impaired by lack of resolution? What is health? And then how can we help, whether it's an individual or a couple or a family or a classroom or a school or a society, how can we help people move from lack of resolution, which we now could define, and then move everyone towards resolution, which is a kind of liberation from the many ways trauma impacts us. So just to begin with your question of relationality, for me as a psychiatrist, those two questions, what's the mind and what's health, were, for me, essential to then try to unpeel what actually is trauma. How does it affect the brain, for example? How does it affect relationships? What is the connection between relationships and the brain? And then to move on from there. So that's kind of setting the stage for, I think, this discussion about trauma, where it from the very beginning, from an attachment point of view, it's a relational field that has a certain characteristic to it we can talk about. Yeah, but it was always relational, and that's one of the most profound forms of trauma, actually, is when it's happening in a relationship that should have been of trust, but there's a betrayal. There's what Jennifer Fried calls betrayal trauma. There's a betrayal of that trust, and that has a profound disorganizing effect on how the mind is now coming to regulate itself.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, beautiful. And so maybe you can speak a little bit to like, what is the mind or the brain, and how is it affected? Like you also, last time, it was beautiful when you said that, when we talked last time about that, you don't discern the body and the mind like as a split view,
Right.
but see them more as one. And maybe I would love you to talk a bit about that, and also maybe then also how trauma affects our brain. So let's maybe continue there.
Yeah, exactly. Well, this is I think the starting place for our discussion is also a starting place, I think, for anyone perhaps joining us in this conversation. And I know this may sound a little strange, but, right now, Thomas, between you and me, and then between anyone who's seeing us or hearing us. What ultimately you could begin to see this as, and this gets to your question of, what is the mind and how does trauma affect the mind or the brain or relationships? We start basically inviting all of us to say, let's slow down and let's realize that what's happening, let's say right now between you and me, is the sharing of energy patterns that are in the channel of air molecules moving for sound and photons of light being passed through this digital medium so that you can see on a screen, for example, since we're not doing this live. But it's the same thing. You have energy patterns of light or energy patterns of air molecules moving. And when we start there, we come to realize that energy flow means change. Energy there's a long discussion about it, but it comes in different forms. It has different contours, locations, intensities, frequencies, forms, and so there's electrical energy, chemical energy, lots of ways of talking about energy. But the bottom line is what happens between you and me right now that's shaping our mind, meaning yours, mine, and ours, and anyone listening to us, are energy patterns. And sometimes energy patterns, like if I go blah, 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 are just pure energy. Sometimes if we say trauma, it's a pattern of energy with a certain formation that symbolizes something other than itself. So it's energy in formation. And in English, we just call that information, and so energy and information is a little redundant because all information is an energy pattern. But anyway, you can say that phrase for lots of reasons. It's good to say it, and it flows. So energy and information flow is really what a relationship is about. It's actually what the brain is about. It's what the body is about. It's what the mind is about. So we come to a really grounded place to say energy and information flow is the stuff of, let's just use the mathematical term, system. You can look at different locations of the system. So you could, if you were a neuroscientist and putting a person in a scanner, say, I want to look at the system that I can see in my scanner, which is the brain. But it turns out that the skull is not a barrier for energy and information to flow. It flows through the whole skin encased body. And lo and behold, the skin is also not an impermeable barrier through which energy and information flows. And so if skull is not a barrier and skin is not a barrier, then you can see that relationships are based on the sharing of energy and information flow, if you will, between two bodies. And so then you say, wow, okay, the system is both internal, if we use the skin as a reference point. It has an internality to it, an interior, an inner aspect. And energy and information flow also has a shared aspect, an inter aspect. And then you go, okay, well, that's interesting. And then it's a long story, and I think this will get us away from trauma, but I'm going to summarize, a whole book called The Developing Mind in like 2 sentences, which is basically, I think the mind, subjective experience, consciousness, information processing, and a fourth thing we'll talk about in a moment, is what's in mathematical terms is called an emergent property of energy and information flow. So emergence is math speak for stuff happens where elements of a system interact and something arises from that interaction that is greater than the individual elements. So the proposal back from 1992 is that mind, subjective experience, consciousness, information processing, is an emergent property of embodied and relational energy flow. And also the fourth facet, to get to the trauma business, is that complex systems, which we don't need to get into that, but there are certain mathematical properties of openness, chaos capability, and what's called nonlinearity. And it looks like the human mind is, in fact, some aspect of a complex system. So one of the aspects, the fourth aspect, would be what mathematics calls the emergent self-organizing process of this complex system. And what that means is that we can define the mind as this emergent, self-organizing, where is it embodied in relational process. What does it do? It regulates the flow of energy and information. And once we define this fourth facet of mind this way, then you can say, what is a way you optimize self-organization? And you do that by linking differentiated parts of the complex system. And we'll just call that integration. So that integration is what creates the most flexible, adaptive, coherent, is resilient over time in math terms, energized and stable states. That spells the word faces. And the bottom line of all this is that the proposal back from the early 90s was that health of the mind is when self-organization is permitted to do what it's naturally driven to do, which is to create integration, to differentiate and link. And that trauma, whether it's on the individual level or the societal level, can be seen as an assault on integration. And that the difference between, for example, in attachment research, a child is experiencing the unresolved effects of a parent's mind that has unresolved trauma or loss. They get massive disintegrative communication of energy and information flow that if you said, then what happens in the brain of the child? If you look at Marty Teicher's work from Harvard at McLean Hospital, developmental trauma results in impaired integration in the brain. It's impaired growth of the corpus callosum, where you're taking the differentiated left and right and linking them, impaired growth of the hippocampus, where you take differentiated areas and link them in memory systems, impairment in the growth of the prefrontal cortex, which links the cortex, the limbic area, the brainstem, the body, and the social world together into one integrated whole. So 5 sources of energy and information flow that are distinct are brought together. And then something called the connectome, which are the more subtly differentiated areas of the brain and the head. You can show how they're linked. This interconnection of the connectome is the best predictor of well-being. And sadly, trauma blocks the growth of the connections of the connectome. So the brain is less integrated. Now, the reason that's important is because every form of regulation seems to depend on integration in the brain. And so when someone like a parent has unresolved trauma, what you see is outcomes of that impaired regulation of emotion, of mood, of narrative, of relationality, of morality sometimes. And so this puts the whole picture together. And you can see in a society, for example, the ripple effects of impaired integration when different members of the society are carrying unresolved trauma. It starts affecting everyone in the system. And, if the leader of a nation is carrying unresolved trauma, or the leader of a school, or the leader of a classroom, or the leader of a family, you can see huge amplified effects of this impaired integration that is in the form of unresolved trauma or loss. So that's the big 30,000-foot view of, what this field I work in, interpersonal neurobiology, says about trauma and the way societal trauma and individual trauma are part of a continuum. And we're all a part of this interconnected system, even though sometimes we act like we're separate selves. We're hugely interconnected.
It's so beautiful to listen to you. It's so lovely. So first of all, wow, it's amazing. And I will come back to the social aspect of it in a second, because I think when we talk about the dimension of collective trauma, that's hugely important. Also, what you said about leadership and how it affects systems. And if I cycle back once more to, so you spoke to or about how trauma affects the kind of integration capacity. So now, what is actually supportive of integrating trauma? So once we are traumatized, what actually is a pathway to health? And maybe the second question also that comes with it, if one generation, for example, doesn't integrate trauma, you said, so for example, it affects our kids, and because they get a lot of impulses of disintegrate or not integrated minds. Would you say that that's the only level that transmits trauma, or does it affect somehow our epigenetic genetic environment, whatever? Does it affect how is trauma being passed on from one generation to the next? Is that a psychological dimension mainly? Is that a biological dimension? Maybe you can speak a bit to that as well.
Yeah, so lots of really great questions. Thank you, Thomas. Let's just start with the epigenetic question. And well, let's start with, people often ask, what's the connection between the mind and the brain? So what we're saying is that if you picture a triangle, we're saying that the brain is a part of the body that facilitates a very intricate and beautiful and mysterious and complex energy and information flow pattern. So basically, it has all sorts of features to it. We'll get into in a moment, but the brain is important. So we're not separating brain from mind. We're just making a stance that makes some people really excited, some people really agitated, that even though Hippocrates said mind is what brain does, and that was 2,500 years ago, the father of modern medicine, and then the grandfather of modern psychology, William James, kind of reaffirmed that. He said many wonderful, wonderful things, but he did reaffirm that. And what we're saying now is that's a part of a much bigger story. And this is a time not just for academic debates about this, but the narrative that the mind is only, _only, what the brain does is a part of a lie of a separate self that allows you to say, oh, if my mind is only what my brain does, then my mind is only in me. And if my self comes from my mind, then it's really all about I, me, mine. And there's a lot of research to show that when you live like that, it's bad, bad, bad. There's lots of really bad things for your personal health. There's bad things for the relational health. And in a way, that's, I think, the collective trauma of humanity, in a way, is that we're living a lie of a separate self in contemporary culture. So I just want to put that on the side, that this is not just an intellectual discussion, that the future of life on Earth, I think, depends on us being really open to the sequence that goes from categories to concepts to linguistic symbols. And we have a linguistic symbol like mind or self that we embed only inside of you as a solo thing, separate self. Mm-hmm. And that is coming from a concept that, who you are is just in your body. And that is built on a category that, there's self and other. And so we begin to other not just people, who are perhaps not like us, but other species. And we think, who cares about the other species? It's just about I, me, mine, So that's a whole nother kind of story. But it is a kind of distorted view of reality that when you adapt to it, it violates something that Peter Fonagy in the attachment world has beautifully named epistemic trust. So in philosophy, you have the study of how things come to be what they are. That's ontology. And then you can also study how we know what we know, which is epistemology. So epistemic trust is where the people who you're relying on to teach you about the nature of reality are telling you something that's true. So on some very sometimes subtle, sometimes not so subtle level, when parents or teachers or leaders in society convey a message of a separate self, you could argue, as Albert Einstein did, that that's an optical delusion of consciousness. A delusion is a psychotic belief. And so as you try to adapt to what your parents tell you, you're Thomas, I'm Danny, and the teachers reaffirm that, get good grades, Thomas, get good grades, Danny, and then society says, yeah, you have a social security number, you have a license plate number for your car, it's your car, all this stuff. And we begin to live like that. Everyone's running around trying to live like that. It's adapting your mind to regulate energy and information flow based on a lie. So the first thing to start with is this sequence of, category, concept, symbol, we have to be very careful of. So then as we unpeel that in terms of your question about epigenetics, there are 4 ways the brain that we're talking about here, which absolutely influences the mind, it's just not the whole of the mind. So you can take 100% of what these magnificent neuroscientists are teaching us, like about neuroplasticity or about epigenetic influences on neural growth, which we'll talk about now. You can take 100% of it and fit it into a larger story. We're not saying get rid of the brain science. We're saying wonderful, 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 put it in a larger context to really understand not just the brain, but the mind. And, I've led groups where when you present it like that, the neuroscientists take a deep breath and they say, I'm with you, and so epigenetics. The reason I think, Thomas, your question is so important is because we now know that, and we're beginning just to unpeel the details of it, that during your own lifetime, you can alter the non-DNA molecules that sit on top of your DNA. So deoxyribonucleic acid is DNA. And it is the kind of molecules that make a chain that form your genes that are all sitting on chromosomes in the nucleus of different cells except your red blood cells. So this DNA has its impact on us when it's expressed. The expression of DNA is where the DNA gets turned into RNA, ribonucleic acid, goes out of the nucleus, goes into the cell body itself, and then it is turned into proteins, basically, and those proteins affect the way the cell functions and interacts with other cells. Okay, so gene expression is basically the way DNA goes to RNA, goes to protein. Fine. We now know that in your very lifetime, continually, even right now in this conversation, the way the brain, just talk about the brain, is responding to experiences in a number of ways. One of them is that you're modifying the non-DNA molecules. So nucleic acids or the deoxyribonucleic acid. These are non-nucleic acids like methyl groups or histones that sit on top of the DNA. And the reason that's important is the way they sit on top of the DNA in certain locations. So epi means on top of. So these are now epigenetic regulators. They will change the shape of the DNA, of the chromosome, to make it translated to the way, basically the way the enzyme is going to turn DNA to RNA will be altered by these epigenetic regulators. So it's kind of like the librarian in a library. It's not the author of the book. You're not changing the book. You're changing whether the librarian's going to let that book out or not, or put it on the counter and encourage people to read it. The librarian has a big influence. He or she may not write the book, but he or she has a big influence on, whether that book gets to impact the world. So the same is true with epigenetic regulators. They're like the librarians. So here's the deal. In your direct experience, you can change those epigenetic regulators to change how your brain responds to experience. So for example, Michael Meany up in McGill in Quebec, in Montreal, in Quebec province, has shown that sadly, if you're traumatized, you change the epigenetic regulators during childhood to actually amplify the part of your brain that's going to be wary for danger. So just to take that as one example of trauma, then epigenetic changes to the individual's own brain will happen. Number 2, you will change sometimes how new neurons can grow, especially in an area called the hippocampus. So less of them grow. That's what Marty Teicher has shown with trauma. So neurogenesis is the second way experience impacts the brain. The third way is synaptic growth. The connections among neurons are called synapses. You can alter those either by decreasing how they grow or taking ones and increasing them, like in vigilance for danger. And the fourth way is you can impact this healthy sheath called myelin. And when myelin is laid down across connected neurons, it does two things. It makes the speed of the conduction of the charge, called an action potential, 100 times faster. And it also makes the resting period between firings, called a refractory period, 30 times briefer. So 30 times briefer multiplied by 100 times faster means 3,000 times, not just effective, but can time the coordination of myelinated neurons so that when you learn a skill, for example, you can myelinate in a different way. So myelin formation, synapse formation, neurogenesis, and epigenetic changes are at least 4 of the established ways all experience, can affect the brain. And the one more thing to say, which I think you're implying, and I'll just say it, is we also are now learning, in addition to all that, and I can just give you one example of my grandmother. When my great-grandfather and my great-grandmother, they were in Europe, in Russia, were walking down the street, my great-grandmother had my grandmother in her womb. And the Cossacks came into the shtetl where the Jews, my family's of Jewish origin, were forced to live. They were considered subhuman and not allowed to be in cities. And the Cossacks came and they murdered my grandfather in front of his pregnant wife. And the research suggests, and my personal experience in my family would support this, that when my grandmother, a female fetus, was growing in her mother's womb at the time of her mother's trauma, that traumatic experience for my great-grandmother is going to impact the maturing eggs of the female fetus in the womb. And studies of diabetes and other things in other countries support this view. For the last 500 years, they have records that support this notion. Then when my grandmother comes out, she's actually not wary for danger because it didn't affect the way her brain was growing, amazingly. But she has eggs that are primed to give birth to kids who are, and her 3 kids were completely primed for danger, unlike my grandmother. So that my father and his siblings, they were as if they had just been in the Holocaust. Which is basically what pogroms were, right? So it doesn't really make that much sense because my mother was super chill, super easy, whatever, even though she left as a 12-year-old and came to this country and all this stuff, the United States. So I just say that because what the new research that's just emerging on epigenetics says is that you can pass along through your eggs for a female and obviously through the sperm for a male who's maybe having trauma during pre-adolescent years when the sperm maturing. So depending on when the gametes, the eggs mature in the female fetus, the sperm mature before adolescence in a male. That looks like that's the pattern we're seeing, but we need to do more research on this. But the point is overall, however this timing male-female works, that the trauma of prior generations can alter the gametes and the way the epigenetic regulators are conforming themselves. And then they get passed in the sperm and egg. And it isn't that you've changed the sequence of DNA. So please don't say, oh, it changes your genetics. That would be too loose. You don't want to say that. You say it changes your epigenetic regulators. Then you'd be right on the money. And then what you'd want to do is help those people who it may have skipped a generation, you see. And so you may not even understand it, or it could be direct if it was for a male. But so we literally can't, if the word inherit means it's passed through the sperm and egg, then it is fair to say you can inherit epigenetic gamete modifications that are then passed along to the next generation.
Fascinating.
In this case, it would be increased wariness for danger, panic attack, anxiety, or other things. So we're just beginning to learn that. You're not changing the sequence of DNA as far as we know, but you're changing the regulators of gene expression, which is just as important.
That's amazing. That immediately reminds me of, because we did a lot of work on the Holocaust past in Germany and Israel. We talked about this before. And also when you speak, it reminds me of a lot of the things I saw in the groups and the big events. And I think many of the individual clients that come definitely underline what you're saying right now.
Yeah. So in terms of your bigger question, like broadly, you might say, well, perhaps you can epigenetically inherit impediments to integration, and that there are many reasons people can bring forward unresolved trauma. So one would be what you inherit. Two would be, and this is what our attachment research shows, the way a parent behaves. Even if they love their kid like crazy and they're absolutely devoted to be a good parent, if they have unresolved trauma, even with those important things, I love my kid, I want to do a good job, they can, by accident, that is not intentionally, be terrifying their kid, even just if they dissociate. And I don't mean just chemical dissociation by being drunk, but literally having dissociation, having screaming attacks, being abusive to a spouse, spacing out. All these things for a young infant and a toddler and a younger child can be very disorienting and distressing and create terror. So with my colleagues, what we feel the foundation of disorganized attachment is when a parent inadvertently, these are nice, wonderful, loving people, but when they have unresolved loss or trauma, they do stuff that is terrifying to their kid, even though they don't want to. So we're not saying, oh, these are the bad parents, not at all. And in fact, in my own, parenting books, I write about, unresolved issues in me as a parent, and, trying to just allow the reader to understand this can happen to anyone, even if you're writing books about this. So tapping into unintegrated aspects of your early life experience, unintegrated aspects of past generations through epigenetic inheritance, unintegrated experience now, that you have the opportunity, and we have this practice called the Wheel of Awareness, which kind of gives you a methodology for entering a space of awareness from which integration can naturally arise. And a lot of people live their lives, especially with unintegrated states, not tapping into that. So the general thing to say is, I believe deeply that integration is the natural drive, health, which comes from integration, natural drive of people, whether it's a society or a classroom or a family or an individual, it's the natural drive, but stuff gets in the way. So one way of talking about, societal trauma or cross-generational trauma or family trauma or, trauma in a classroom or trauma in the individual is that there's stuff in the way that is blocking the natural drive for integration to arise. And when integration is released, oh my gosh, you can feel it. It's kindness, it's care, it's love, it's this exuberance, it's this energy. And, these workshops we do with the wheel, it's so amazing just to give people a step-by-step methodology to, this isn't therapy, but it's just learning a practice to drop into the hub of the wheel, to see the blockages on the rim, basically, and then to find the courage to drop into this incredible place of what initially is uncertainty comes to be experienced not just as uncertainty, which it remains, but as freedom and possibility. And so this is where you say, well, why wouldn't everyone just naturally, spontaneously resolve trauma? If integration is a natural push, how does that make sense? Why don't they just spontaneously integrate, And the reason is because trauma induces blockages to integration that have a lot to do with the fear of uncertainty.
Fascinating. Beautiful. And maybe I want to give a moment, because you said so many important things that like everybody who listens to this now as a moment to, to take in the depth of what you're saying, because it feels so essential to me. Like many things that you said, I think can be unpacked. Of course, they are all deep, but like there's a lot of depth to what you're sharing with us, and so maybe two things that I think we could focus on still in this conversation. I want to come in a moment to the collective part of this, because I think that's something that we are seeing also a lot now all over the world. But before we get there, you said before, at the beginning of our conversation, you spoke about the trauma that creates disorganized attachment, and then when a parent actually has integrated the trauma, it doesn't do that. And I would love to see, in your experience as a clinician and as a researcher, do you see that for people that really go through the process of trauma integration, is there anything that you found that shows that there is an additional resilience or a learning process that is more than returning to ground zero? So let's say there's, like, you're traumatized, you come up to your, let's say, healthy state, but is the integration of trauma teaching you something that is a kind of, once you went through the full cycle or through a cycle that is more integrated, that there's actually a new ability that life creates through trauma healing? Or what's your experience about trauma and resilience? And when we go through our trauma healing, like, what are we becoming? What's becoming in the process?
Well, that's a beautiful question, Thomas. I know there's a whole field of research in post-traumatic growth that, as contrasted to post-traumatic stress disorder. And I think those researchers would completely agree with you that there's a certain growth that an individual experiences through, I don't know if they use the word integration, but we can use it, certainly. I don't think they do. But through this integrative process of resolving trauma is really what post-traumatic growth is all about. And in that view, if I understand it properly from the research, their perspective is, yes, you do achieve, this resilience and this increased vitality. Not that you would invite trauma, to come into your life, and that's not what we're saying. But if trauma has come into your life, how do you make meaning of the trauma and become stronger and more resilient? Not in spite of it, but actually because of it. Mm. So, yes. So I think from the research point of view, I think that's true. From the empirical work in attachment research, it's a little bit complicated. We do have formal terms called earned secure attachment in an adult. And I'd have to review the research to see, because it turns out there's two kinds of earned security. So the data would probably be a little complicated. One is called continuous secure, and the other is discontinuous secure earned. It's complicated. And so there are some empirical reasons why it might at this moment be a hard question to answer from a research point of view. But I can tell you, as a clinician, let me just speak to that. Mm-hmm. For whatever reason, maybe it's because of my early training in trauma, trauma is like the main thing that I became known for in Los Angeles. And so, I've worked with many, many people who have severe trauma histories, and just from a clinical point of view, but it's really not research, you see the person before, I don't see them before the trauma, but I see them, they come because they've been traumatized, or they come to realize that they had trauma in their attachment experiences. That's more common. And then I see the incredible growth, and I see when they liberate themselves from the unresolved states of loss or trauma, and we're talking about abuse, of sexual abuse, physical abuse, verbal abuse, emotional abuse, or neglect, they come out with incredible strength. And, you get the feeling, this again is not empirical data, it's just clinical experience, and it's a feeling. You get the feeling of a kind of robustness and a deep gratitude for life and a capacity to connect with other people with amazing empathy and compassion without losing themselves, because they've done this incredible, courageous journey of healing their trauma, that I would say, yeah, that's consistent with empirical studies on post-traumatic growth. And what I bet you would find, if we could tease apart the Earn Secure studies, and you certainly see this in the field I'm in, is adult attachment interview research. That's my training, and so you do see in the narrative a person who has gone through a very difficult time in their childhood, who's made sense of it and has integrated it. There's a kind of quality of presence that has a kind of electricity to it, kind of energy and openness, that it's inspiring, and you feel enlivened, and that's very different from, someone who has an adult attachment interview where there were no challenges and they're a lovely person and they're kind of, well, yeah, life is good and what's the big deal, versus life can be so terrible and I've worked through the horror, and oh my God, the sun came up this morning. Whoa, it was beautiful. And last night the sunset was miraculous, and I'm just so grateful. This precious day is something we're here to share. That often comes from someone who's worked through trauma and realizes what a gift life is.
Oh, that's so beautiful. It's also so touching. It's lovely, yeah. So when we see that there is kind of there is something that's growing out of it, there is some kind of learning process that a human being goes through, and most probably, as you said before, the human being is embedded in and as a system in its environment. So now, why I was interested in setting up this summit and sparking a conversation, a wider conversation on collective trauma, was through all the things that I've seen in my whatever groups, seminars, workshops around the world. But basically, it started in Germany with the Holocaust, and then Germany and Israel, and so I'm interested in your take on when you see something like a massive wound. And you said before we started the conversation, today is the kind of 400th anniversary day of the first slavery ship coming to
North America.
We can take now any example, but because I speak from my experience, so I speak more about what I've seen in Europe, like a massive impact on a society and a cultural system. So if you take now, if you're not focusing on the individual, we are focusing on the whole system. And so I'm very interested to hear you speak a little bit to the challenge, the cultural challenge that we see, and if it's North America, if it's Europe, if it's Asia, if it's any kind of genocide or dictatorship around the world that had a massive impact onto the society. So how would you speak to the challenge of the whole human system, where actually the traumatization or the unintegrated traumatization in over multiple generations is actually reinforcing itself as a systemic effect. And so I would like to hear your thoughts, even maybe if that's not your main area of work, but how you look at that, how culture deals with a massive trauma scar that is somehow not integrated.
Yes, so let's talk about, and maybe we'll end up referring to three things. One of, you mentioned the stealing of people from Africa and bringing them to the United States starting in August, the end of August, 1619. And what that meant for American culture is one topic, just to honor that on this day, and what society had to do to enslave people. And we'll get into that in just a moment. I think we need to also make sure to touch on the trauma that humans are inflicting on nature and the denial that many humans are in about climate change issues that are, in fact, caused by human societies and human way of life. You flip from denial to despair so rapidly, and we'll talk about that maybe a little bit too. But I do have direct experience, like you, with Germany and with the Holocaust. So I'll just mention the two things just to say. The first is years ago, I was asked to go to Berlin, where you are now, and to spend a week with researchers from around the world, many of them from Germany, about the human brain and society and narrative and memory. So in Berlin, before the Holocaust memorial was finished, it was just being built then. So this must have been around 2007 or 8. I don't know when it was completed. They had started it, but it was just in the beginning stages. So there's that I want to share a little bit about. But the other I just say is that, I was the psychiatrist for the survivors of the Shoah Foundation. And so we collected 55,000 interviews. So 55,000 people were interviewed. The interviews were anywhere from 4 to 8 hours. And we have that data now distributed around the planet, digitalized, coded, of direct reports of people's experience, so that when Holocaust deniers say it never happened, we have actually the data that disproves that. Anyway, so part of that job was to go to Eastern Europe, and I went to Poland, and I visited many concentration camps, and so I had that experience just to talk about and what that was like. So that's the background. I'll just say this, that the broad view I think that we should start with is, we're born into a body that has an evolutionary history. And this evolutionary history includes what my colleague Stephen Suomi, who studies primate behavior, suggests is not just a human phenomenon, but has probably been with us in our primate history for 50 million years. Humans, some people say, have been around 200,000 years. Some say 400,000 years. Our human cousins, maybe 4 million years, 5 million years, something like that. Not 50 million years. But in any event, we have behavioral data that Steve Suomi suggests has existed for 50 million years, which is to make in-group, out-group distinctions. And that we survived as primates by figuring out who's in the in-group, and I collaborate with them, I connect with them, I treat with them with kindness and care, and we groom each other and all that stuff. And we're wary of the out-group. And whenever we get a chance, sadly, with this, the monkey studies have shown, we will destroy those other people in the out-group. So we can become the dominant group, our in-group. So that's our primate legacy. And then as humans, we developed another capacity, which is called alloparenting, A-L-L-O. Allo means other, parenting. And what this means, and Sarah Hrdy, H-R-D-Y, she writes about this very powerfully in a book called Mothers and Others. And Sarah and I spent a week in a think tank about the new human narrative. And what she beautifully writes about alloparenting is that one of the unique things about our human history, so now we're talking about maybe for the last 200,000 years, is that we share the care of our infants with non-birth parents. Right? This is very unusual. You don't see a dog picking out another dog to take care of her puppies, or you don't see a rat doing that, or even other apes. But we do it. And what that meant was that we had to read the mind of other members of our village to say, where's your attention, Thomas? What's your intention, Thomas? Where's your awareness, Thomas? Those are all mental processes. So if I could read your mind properly, I give you my baby because I trust you. You're in my in-group already, but I got to figure out your mind. Okay, and you become a fuller, more intricate, complex being because I can read your signals and get a sense of your subjective state of intention, attention, and awareness. So basically, these, I call it mind sight, these abilities to mentalize, Peter Fonagy calls it, to see the mind of the other, was probably born at this moment 200,000 years ago of alloparenting being necessary. Those parents that couldn't read the mind of the other and gave their infant to someone who wasn't trustworthy, the infant died, they didn't pass on their genes. And so we probably have this genetic DNA sequence business of this mind sight capacity. Other animals have it too, but we definitely have it in a big way. Okay, so that's 200,000 years now. Now you come to more modern times, 40,000, 30,000 years ago, when we have evidence that we start doing cave paintings and start telling stories and have this intricate way that we make sense of the world through these, categories and concepts and even symbols. In those days, it was symbols on a cave. And maybe language. We don't have recordings, or no one was writing books or anything like that. So we likely developed this representational mind where we represented the world in what looked like story form. So we not only have memory, like other animals, of course, but we have this really interesting thing where we can make representations, called representations, of events that, sorry for the sirens out there.
That's right.
We'll just wish them well. So as the siren goes by, you and I and anyone listening can imagine the subjective experience of the patient in that ambulance and wish them well. We can have a story in our minds. This is a person who did this or that or whatever it is. So we became narrative creatures where we make sense of life through story. We integrate experience, if you will, take the different components and link them together through story. We have, and in Berlin, I was there for a week with Endel Tolving, who's like the father of modern memory research. So Endel and I would sit next to each other and walk back and forth to the meeting hall. And Endel has this beautiful term called mental time travel. And humans have this capacity. Maybe other animals do, but we have no evidence for that. But certainly humans do, where you make a representation of the past, you have a representation of the future, your imagined future, and a representation of the present. So that's this linking of past, present, future. This becomes very important for trauma because, when we then move now forward, we're now in the representational era of 30 to 40,000 years ago, you now move forward to an era where this in-group, out-group distinction becomes even more important once we start accumulating stuff. Because now we've got stuff like food. And when we left our time of just being hunter-gatherers and wandering around as nomads, and we started having a place to grow our food, collect our food, share it with the in-group only, but then the out-group saw our food. And now we had to amplify this in-group, out-group distinction. All the studies suggest what are called terror management studies or mortality salient studies. Same thing. When you flash a very quick photo of someone pointing a gun at you, you quickly increase the in-group, out-group distinction, and you treat people in the in-group with more kindness and care and protection. You treat the out-group as if they're just physical objects without a mind. You dehumanize them. And, of course, that is the understandable and sad and profoundly painful source of genocide for human beings, is we not only other the out-group, but we dehumanize the out-group and then get them out of their way. So whether you're talking about the Holocaust or you're talking about slavery, where we dehumanize human beings that, we said, oh, these are black people who are slaves, that whole 400-year history in North America. And there's an incredible New York Times project called the 1619 Project, 400 years ago project, that really said this incredible, powerful thing that white people had to dehumanize black people in order to have them as their slaves. And so you see this unfortunate brain capacity, and you can show this in the brain in amazing studies. It doesn't have to be just skin color or religion. You can even do it on, all sorts of factors. I can tell you the studies if you want, but in very subtle ways, if we put someone in an out group, we shut off our circuitry of empathy and compassion. Our mind sight circuits that see the mind of the other person are shut off completely. So when I was at Medonek, one of the terrible of many camps in Poland, the person touring us there had been a kid in the apartments that you could see from the crematorium at the top of this hill. And I said, gosh, what was it like to be a child growing up? He goes, I know this is going to sound bizarre, but those guards who were here gassing people and then burning their bodies, and we could see the bone chips there, right there. He said, they were nice people. They would play with their dogs and they would play with their kids. They were nice people. And this mind sight ability can be turned on for your kids and your dogs or shut off for the Jews. And you can slaughter 6 million people and just think you're going to work. So in terms of this history, and we see this, I have a colleague who was present during the Rwanda genocide, and this way of seeing this, or people from South Africa, where, apartheid was absolutely a kind of dehumanization of blacks from the European whites. And, we have this history that has to be incorporated into the narrative for us to make sense of it, of in-group, out-group distinction, of dehumanizing the out-group and killing them. And when I was in Berlin with Endel Tolving and Catherine Nelson and other folks in the memory world, and I would speak to the professors from Germany, they were not really open, I got to say, to having a conversation about this. And what I was told, and I don't know if this is true because it may be a distorted narrative, but what I was told was that when those folks were growing up, when they were in school or what they heard from their parents did not include a narrative of the Holocaust. That World War II was, World War II, but it wasn't about the genocide. And that came out like somewhere, and I don't know if this is true, but this is what I was told. So you can tell me if it's true, Thomas, because this is Germany. That in 1980 or 81, a documentary came out about the Shoah, about the Holocaust, that for many people shocked them. Because a lot of people in school, it wasn't in the books. It wasn't in the classrooms. So in terms of the collective, what's called noosphere, the sphere of knowledge, it was not the cultural narrative that we, the German people, had murdered, millions and millions and millions of people. That just was not there. We were fighting for our rights, and yes, we had countries against us, and yes, we lost and whatever, but it wasn't about the genocide. I don't. Do you know if that's true? Because if that's true, then it says something about the collective narrative actually lying about the nature of what actually happened, and then not only reparation of the people who were so slaughtered and things stolen from them, but the whole narrative becomes a narrative of a lie.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
you can tell me.
In my understanding, I don't know if it's really true that there was no education about it. I think but what was true and what is very well known here is that there was, they call it, like in English we would say, like the kind of period or phase of silence. The people didn't talk. There was kind of this kind of muteness that didn't convey information. Maybe that's what you're referring to. I'm not sure about the education system as such, but I think in many families there was kind of this phase of silence over kind of a longer period of time. And I think that's what you're referring to. And it was a very well-known phenomenon until that has been kind of broken, this silence. And then I think many more things came out, and also the intensity for the next generation or the next generations of what really happened became more apparent. And I think that's also why we see now because the big events that we did here in Germany, they had a lot of attraction. Like so many people came. They were really big, very big, and I think now there's a high level engagement, at least in the circles that I'm in contact with, to really work on this. And I think that there is a lot. And what also happened after the war, I think, is that East and West Germany got split, and that also created another collective trauma layer on top of the former one. And we just recently had our Celebrate Life Festival, and we had an East-West process. And it is so amazing how you can see many things that you said right now. Like we have on video, like we videoed this process, and you can really see the externalization of the internal kind of architecture of the nervous system. You could see this, how the two sides of the room, the East and the West of Germany and Europe, really look different when they create their fields, like when their system is more crystallized, when it's not. And so I think that speaks a lot to all of what you shared with us.
Yeah, and it's worth saying, and I don't know if you saw this in those groups, when integration is not unfolding, it goes to either chaos, rigidity, or both. Mm-hmm. And unresolved trauma can be seen as that. And, I know I did work also in Poland, but also Hungary, after the wall came down with, over 15 former Soviet satellite countries, to help them deal with trauma. And we had these intensive trainings because in the Soviet system, you weren't allowed to talk about trauma. And you could feel that difference, people really shut down. And this relates to what you're saying, Thomas, the way to understand a coherent narrative is you feel the freedom to articulate in a narrative, which is a linear telling of a sequence of events that includes not just the physical events that happen, but the mental events, the inner mental experience of the people in the experience. So when there is something that is forced to be silent, there's a kind of a way it drains, like a black hole in the universe. It drains the energy out of a system. And the movement through that black hole into what is unspeakable, whether it's childhood abuse or the Holocaust or whatever, is a necessary step to allow the narrative freedom to literally integrate, in the sense of, I'm going to differentiate here are the things I don't want to know, I need to know. And I need to then put these things I didn't want to know before out into the open, both in journal writing and maybe in sharing it with a trusted other, or maybe in a group setting, where I come to a transformation where before I couldn't even speak about these things. And now I put them out there and I feel really uncomfortable. I feel unsettled. I don't know what's going to happen. Is a reorganization of this rigid or chaotic state. And in the reorganization, it's very uncomfortable. And then I move into another place where, and I'll use the forgiveness word. There's lots of ways of understanding what forgiveness means. But part of it means giving up all hope for a better past. And when you think about it that way, and I didn't make that phrase up, Jack Kornfield, who I teach with a lot, he quotes someone, I can't remember who he's quoting, but that way of looking at forgiveness says, I have to move forward by actually integrating what happened, not ignoring what happened, not just saying, oh, it didn't happen. That's not forgiveness. That's just delusion.
Right.
But to deeply go into that and say, how do we move forward in the future and say, I had a family that was responding to in-group, out-group distinctions with the threat of economic stuff, where we took Russians and Jews and gypsies and homosexuals and everyone else we're going to murder and put them in the out-group. We dehumanized them. We killed them. This is terrible that we did that my family did that my father did that. And I'm going to own that. Mm-hmm. And just be real with what actually happened.
Right.
Beg your forgiveness for that. And in the opening up of that, I'm much less likely to ever do something like that. If I hide it, it's much more likely to burst out and do it again because I'm hiding the truth. So that would be what societal, collective trauma, when it's not worked through, would look like as you're working through it. And then the release from that and the realizing, okay, we're all human. And it is fair to say, I think humans are capable of this. You see genocide all over the place, right? And we need to then move through that so that we can prevent it from happening in the future.
Beautiful. Wow, it's so amazing. I deeply agree with everything you're saying. It's so beautiful. Also, the way how you put it together in a very essential way. It's beautiful to listen to. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Thomas. Thank you for your wonderful work.
And maybe then one last question: if you have anything, like maybe something that people that are listening right now, is there any kind of practice or any kind of, I don't know, something a nugget that we can take into our daily life?
Yeah.
That is helpful.
Yeah. Well, it's so interesting. This wheel of awareness I mentioned. Go to our website, drdansiegel.com, and go to the Wheel of Awareness under resources, and for free, we have found a lot of people who begin to access that hub of pure awareness. And simply the nugget is, when you learn the power of distinguishing awareness from the thing you're aware of, like a memory or an idea or a thought or whatever is on the rim, and you get the strength of distinguishing hub of awareness from the rim of what you're aware of, people find then the strength to start doing the integrative work of healing trauma and loss. And if they haven't done that, then they get lost on the rim. It becomes overwhelming, and they just retreat again into these kind of imprisoning elements of the rim. We call them plateaus, that keep you from dropping into this hub of freedom and possibility, because it feels, as it is, full of uncertainty. So, I think that that's one helpful skill you can learn. The other, and this relates to the larger thing we started with about the environment and climate challenges we have now, I do believe that the contemporary cultural message of a separate self is a traumatizing lie. That when it's soaked in and people try to live with it, it creates alienation, isolation, anxiety, depression, suicidality. A lot of the rise of what we're seeing can be attributed to this view of the separate self. So it isn't that we get rid of the individual aspect of who we are, the I or me, but we take that and we link it to the differentiated relational self of a we or an us. And we have this fun way to do that of me plus we equals mwe, M-W-E. And I do feel very deeply in working with people now with these practices that the mwe identity, it may be our very direct and simple, may not be easy, way to pull out of this lie of a separate self. It'll help with individualized traumas. It'll help with family trauma. It'll help with collective societal trauma. It'll even help with the trauma that we're inflicting on the environment. So it's a win-win-win thing. Individuals will benefit, relationships will benefit, and the planet's living environment will benefit. Earth has been waiting for us to wake up from the delusion of a separate self. So this discussion of collective trauma, I think, has underneath it this contemporary message of a lie that, like any trauma that's hidden and has to be just kept away, we can live ourselves into a more mwe way of integrating identity. And I think that's a very important step for all of humanity to take.
Beautiful. Thank you so much. I mean, it's so beautiful. Said it over and over again. Thank you for having you here. I had an amazing hour now. Then.
Oh, thank you, Thomas. It's wonderful to chat with you. And anytime in the future, let's continue the conversation.
I'm up for it, of course. Yes. Thank you so much. Then. Thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you.